In the minds of children, particularly those living in a place as full of stories and whispers as Molten, even the most seemingly innocent of things can take on a sinister and dark character. It's not something people talk about a lot, but there is something in kids, call it human nature or whatever, but there is something that seeks out and actually enjoys the gruesome, the cruel, and the pleasingly creepy. Look at any of the better stories for kids, from traditional fairy tales of wolves and witches to Rollo Dolly and even Harry Potter, and you'll see it. Always a certain undertone of darkness mixed into the seemingly innocent silliness of the story. Whilst a lot of people would go out of their way to keep anything remotely scary away from kids, when left to their own devices, we tend to find that they kind of enjoy the thrill of being scared. Along, it's just enough. Though of course sometimes, things happen in real life that go far beyond just enough. It's for this reason, this same dark streak within them, that kids tend to make up things, to invent wicked and often surprisingly gruesome make-believe worlds and strange scenarios for the things and folks they see around them. In Molten, it's the reason why a harmless scarecrow like Old Ragbag, who was little more than a collection of old clothes and straw, could become some kind of local boogeyman, or why an innocent and totally ordinary telephone box could transform into some kind of monolith to the dark. It's why Mrs. Ledley's daily trips to the wool shop were, for us, a strange and far more malevolent ritual than they first appeared. On the face of things, the wool and knitting shop toward the end of Molten High Street was just a quaint and outdated anomaly. A weird little addition to what was otherwise a perfectly normal high street with the usual collection of shops, cafes, and grocers. We had a Woolworths, a Chippy, a bedding shop, and a Tesco. We also had the wool shop, which even as kids we thought was a bit weird. Surely, we used to joke, there can't be that much demand in the late 1990s for a place that sells sewing and knitting supplies. Not when there's literally a place to buy clothes at either side of it and more charity shops here than any one town deserves. To us as teenagers, the idea that anyone would spend money and time on knitting needles and yarn seemed perfectly antique and out of place and odd. So, naturally, we started weaving with words, knitting and stitching stories to explain this oddity. The majority of those stories centered on the place itself. Rumors that the seemingly innocent wool and sewing shop was actually a front, and that the little old lady that ran it was really the matriarch of a massive crime family, laundering money through this legitimate business that nobody, particularly the police, would suspect. This in turn developed into stories of the old woman's exploits, how, despite looking innocent, she ordered beatings of rivals, and behind the multicolored balls of yarn, she had a number of loaded shotguns stored, all of which we knew was nonsense. What we didn't know was that the other target for tale-making would turn out to be far worse than what we had ever imagined. Waiting outside the newsagents after school, each day for the bus, we would see the wool shop on the other side of the road and watch Miss Ledley shuffle slowly toward the shop with her empty carriage bag in hand. Every day, like clockwork, she would enter the shop and after about 20 minutes, just before our bus arrived, would leave with ball upon ball of wool. We would glide past her, trudging back up the road and see her from the bus clutching a bag full of colored wools. At least 6 or 7 every single day. Looking back now, what we should have seen and recognized was a lonely old woman making the trip every day, not out of any actual need for wool, but because she just wanted company and conversation with the owner each day. What we did instead was speculate about why anyone would need that much damn wool. We discussed her house, piled from floor to ceiling with hundreds upon hundreds of balls of every conceivable color, and joked about how she must have the best insulated house in Molten, and even if she didn't, she must have about 1 million knitted jumpers, so there was no chance of her getting cold. Eventually, though, that dark streak began again to bleed into the stories. Someone suggested that the wool was being used not to insulate the house or make woolen garments, but was being packed around the corpse of her dead husband. That he was packed in some cupboard or a small wooden trunk and that the wool was used to absorb the smell. Whoever it was telling the story would add details, like the fact that she burnt the wool each morning and that was why she needed fresh wool every afternoon. Others said that she was winding the wool into long threads around the body like a strange rainbow-colored mummy, preserving the body. It wasn't until I was in my final year at high school, however, that one of my friends, a lad called Johnny Dixon, came into school with what he claimed was a true story about exactly what she did with all that wool. According to Johnny, he had been walking with his dog on a path around the back of Acres Wood and on a whim had decided to take a slightly different route home. He explained that this was around 5 p.m., which in Moulton in winter is an hour or so after sundown, and around an hour after he and the other lads would have caught the bus home and watched old Miss Lily take her last bunch of wool home. "They came around the corner onto the path," said John, looking convincingly worried by what he was telling us. "And there she was, just winding the wool round and round the trees. Honestly, it was everywhere, stretched right across the road, all different colors, but literally like meters and meters of it, right up into the trees and wound out between the branches like a massive fishing net or something. I mean, it was all over the place, but it wasn't random. Some bits had been sort of woven together, you know? Like there was a pattern or some kind of sense to it. Christ knows what the mad old bat was up to, but it looked like she was, I don't know, making something." I remember we all laughed at John as he said this, ribbing and kneading him that maybe she was making jumpers and scarves for the trees, because as we all know, trees get a bit chilly this time of year. This I remember us laughing at, but I also remember John's face. He wasn't laughing. For once he looked kind of shell-shocked and timid, as if seeing what he'd seen had shaken him up for some reason. It was out of character, and I remember that even at the time I noticed it. Whatever he had seen up in Acres Woods, it had affected him. Later, on the bus home, I sat next to John as the others teased and ribbed him about Miss Leadley, who we could all see through the window as the bus pulled away. "Hey, look, John!" someone shouted. "It's that hot chick you've been sneaking off to meet in the woods, and maybe she'll knit you a blanket that you can get under together." Again, John didn't laugh. It's strange, because sitting there in broad daylight on the top deck of the bus surrounded by a group of rowdy teenagers, through the noise, the fag smoke and the tinny music played from someone's crappy little radio, he shouldn't have been able to scare me. But scare me, he did. Leaning in toward me, he quietly said, "There was more to it, you know, to all that wool." I turned toward him, and in short, almost whispered sentences, he allowed the rest of the story to leak out of him as if it were some horrible liquid he was expelling in a seeping pool. "They might all laugh, but I'm telling you, mate, it was weird. Coming onto that path just when it's going dark and seeing some old woman just winding wool dead slow around a tree, it gave me the creeps. It wasn't even what she was doing so much as how she did it. Like she was deliberately really slow, like, I don't know, sort of carefully and considerably, even weirder. She didn't notice me. She never flinched, never moved. She just kept on going like I wasn't even there." Somewhere behind us, a girl shrieked a high-pitched wail that was far too dramatic, and a boy shouted something crude at her from the front of the bus, over our heads. Below the ramble, though, I could see that as he was telling me, John was almost crumbling. "That's not all," he half muttered in a whisper. "Around some of the trees there were these hanging down, like fruits or like knitted bags of wool. They look like decorations or something, but more than that, they look like them those things that insects go into, you know, when they're going to change into butterflies or whatever." I figured that John meant chrysalis and nodded. I started to ask what a wooden chrysalis actually looked like when he turned to stare me straight into the eyes, looking not just at, but it seemed into me. Then, with a croaked voice that was almost a whisper, he said, "This is, in all of them, there was something in them, like moving, wriggling, squirming around inside, stretching the sides and pushing against it like they were trying to get out, like something alive in there. I know it sounds mental, but I don't think she was making a net. I think she was making a web." I won't lie and say that those words didn't creep me out. The image it created of a huge spider's web, woven of wool and stretched between trees, hanging there in the middle of the path, all of those different threads wound in different colors and yet all looking black in the darkness, touched a nerve within me, and I felt my stomach tighten. Not just at the thought of the web itself, but of the kind of thing that might need a web like that, and what such a thing might feed upon. John wasn't in school the next day. When he did come back in about a week later, he looked thin, as if he had had a bad case of flu and had dropped about 2 stone in weight over the course of a few days. At lunchtime, I caught him in one of the cloakrooms and asked him where he'd been. At first, he just said he'd been sick, but eventually he gave in and, looking around him so as to ensure there was no one else around, said quietly, "I went up there again without the dog. I went to see what she'd made and it was there, the big web. The pouch things were there as well, but nothing was moving in them now. But out of the bottom of one I saw." He stopped for a second and swallowed hard. "I saw a cat's tail." I watched him cringe and almost, I thought, vomit at the memory. "I ripped them open one after another, and they were all in there. Cats, birds, rats, squirrels, and all sorts. Some of them fresh and some of them all rotted and just bones. All of them wound up in yarn, like flies in a spider web." I asked John if he'd called the police, if he'd reported what he'd found or reported Miss Leadley for doing it in the first place. He said he had, but only a few days later. "Thing is," he said slowly, "and you won't believe this, but I touched the wool, didn't I? I moved it when I was getting them cats out." I nodded, not quite following what he meant, when I noticed that John Dixon, one of the biggest lads in our year, had started to cry. "At first I thought it was a kitty, like a young boy or a toddler or whatever. It came down towards me, but then it sort of scurried into a hole at the bottom of a tree." "What did?" I asked, in equal measure confused and terrified. "I don't know," he said finally. "But whatever it was, when it ran away, it had more than 2 legs." For the next 6 months of my high school career, I would watch Miss Leadle from the bus window, toitering innocently back with ball upon ball of wool, and would wonder just how true what John told me was. As it turned out, very. Margaret Leadle was sentenced in 2000 for several acts of animal cruelty. The details were never made fully public, but the story went that she had been found hanging cats and dogs from trees using wool that she'd bought in Moulton. The info in the papers said nothing about the web or why the mad old cow had done what she did, nor did it mention the thing she'd been feeding in the woods. The wool shop in Moulton closed in 2001. After that, I have no idea where Miss Leadle got her wool or what became of the thing she was feeding. But I do know that John found a new place to walk his dog.